able to use the great amounts of money that they'd accumulated selling stocks to buy back into the stock market at 5% of what it would have cost them had they bought before the crash. Great fortunes were made, and of course, many, many people were destroyed. But the stock market crash, the depression that began, invited massive government intervention. And the plan was to have the United States government take over control of business and industry. Not ownership, but control. The National Recovery Act that later became something very prominent in the Roosevelt administration was something proposed to President Herbert Hoover, who refused to go along with it. Herbert Hoover did involve himself in other aspects of insider activity, but he did not want to go along with that. And so President Roosevelt was proposed for the Democrat Convention in 1932, a convention which had a platform that was very conservative in its text. One of its planks in the platform actually called for the removal of government-founded fields of private enterprise. Get government out of all private enterprises. That doesn't sound like the Roosevelt administration, but that's the platform that he ran on. He was nominated by the Democrats in 1932, and after the convention was over, he headed back to New York, where he lived, and sailed right by his own home and went up to Massachusetts, to a little town called Magnolia, a subdivision of Gloucester, Massachusetts, to visit an old man. He went to visit Edward Mandell House. And as sometimes has been said, the whole thing was in the bag right from the beginning. Roosevelt's activities greatly increased the scope of government, greatly entangled us in all kinds, eventually entangled us in all kinds of internationalism, prolonged the Depression. And it was the start of Council on Foreign Relations members becoming very prominent in the government of the United States. In the late 1930s, a special Council on Foreign Relations group was formed called the War and Peace Studies Group. They volunteered to help the State Department. Their volunteering was accepted. They eventually took over the State Department. They began to prepare for the next war. Prominent CFR members in the Roosevelt administration included Stettinius and Stimson and Sumner Welles. Something else happened during this period, too, and that was when Martin Dies, a congressman from Texas, went to visit President Roosevelt. Martin Dies was the chairman of a House committee formed to investigate the communist penetration of our government. It eventually became the House Committee on Un-American Activities. It wasn't called that back then. But Martin Dies went to the president and privately told him that he had compiled lists of thousands of communists and communist agents and sympathizers working for the government of the United States. And President Roosevelt got furious at him and ended up by telling him, "Some of my best friends are communists." And he tossed him out of his office. Some of the communists who came into power, into government position during that period included Alger Hiss and Lachlan Curry, who were not only communists, but were also members of the Council on Foreign Relations eventually. And the preparations then began for the United States to enter World War II. But we have to realize, of course, that President Roosevelt was telling everybody that we're not going to have to go to war. He said it, in his own terminology, he said, "I tell you again and again and again, your sons are not going to have to fight in a foreign war." Well, there's an interesting story, an interesting bit of history that has been buried largely, but we've found out about it. We certainly expect that it will help people to understand what was going on, and we certainly believe it to be true. And it's the story of a man named Tyler Kent. There's a little book, The Case of Tyler Kent, originally published in 1946 and reissued in 1962. It's not available anymore, I'm sorry to say, but it is quite interesting history. Tyler Kent was a career diplomat. Still a young man, he was the son of a career diplomat. And Tyler Kent had already served time as a diplomat in Moscow for the United States Diplomatic Corps. He was then assigned to England at our embassy in England. And he was given the job of the code clerk, and that's the number 3 position, as I understand it, in a embassy. It's not what it sounds like, a simple clerk. No, it's a very important position. And this was Tyler Kent's position when, in 1939, he was asked to transmit a message from the embassy in London to the government in Washington, D.C. And it was actually a message from Winston Churchill to Franklin Roosevelt. Now again, Winston Churchill at this point was not the prime minister. And for anybody other than the head of state to communicate in a diplomatic way with the head of state, with another head of state, was a total violation of diplomatic procedure. In other words, Churchill should not have been communicating with the President of the United States until he became prime minister. He was not, as I said, prime minister at this point. And so he not only was violating the procedures, but he came and he brought the message, and it was already in the America's unbreakable code, which obviously had been broken or given to the British. So here's Tyler Kent now asked to transmit this message. But beyond these aspects of the diplomatic procedures being broken, the message itself is amazing. Here's what it said. Remember now, this is from Churchill to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I am half American and the natural person to work with, you. It is evident we see eye to eye. Were I to become Prime Minister of Britain, we could control the world. The message was sent. Tyler Kent was asked to send many other messages. Tyler Kent began to collect these messages, make copies of these messages to protect his own hide, and then at a point in time to be able to warn the Congress of the United States about what was going on. In May of 1940, Tyler Kent was arrested by British authorities. He had his diplomatic immunity waived for him by his ambassador, Joseph P. Kennedy. He was tried by the British. He was convicted by the British. He was sent to a British prison, and he stayed in a British prison until 6 months after the European War had ended. Joseph P. Kennedy was a mixed bag. The whole Kennedy family at this point was a mixed bag. Kennedy has made his fortune by being tipped off about the stock market crash. Kennedy was then involved with the America First movement and the group of Americans trying to keep us out of World War II. Joseph P. Kennedy was favorable to that point of view. He was the ambassador to Britain. The British didn't like the fact that Joseph P. Kennedy wanted to keep America out of World War II. The British wanted us in. Kennedy was on his way back to the United States, expected to make a radio speech, a nationwide radio speech about our involvement in the war, against our involvement in the war. He was told to go to Washington and visit with the president. He came out of the meeting with the president, and he gave a pro-British speech. Tyler Kent was the son of a diplomat who had now been deceased. His mother, therefore, was someone who knew diplomatic procedures. She fought all during World War II to get justice for her son. She got nowhere. In October of 1944, she wrote a letter to Congress, and she said in her letter, Tyler Kent was jailed to keep him silent, jailed to keep him from imparting to you, members of Congress, information which you have a right to know. He was finally freed. He came home in December of 1945, and when he got off the ship, he was interviewed, and he said that he could solve the riddle about the origin of the war as far as the United States was concerned. He wrote to the Senate committee that was investigating all of this, supposedly, Senator Alben Barkley heading it. And he told them he had the moral right to copy those messages. He offered to tell his story. He got nowhere. There's something else that's interesting that happened in that whole story, and that is that 3 years before our country got involved in the war, and about 18 months before Tyler Kent's arrest in 1940, there was a book published in England called Propaganda in the Next War. The author was an Englishman, Sidney Rogerson. On page 148 of this book, we read, "It will need a definite threat to America, a threat, moreover, which will have have to be brought home by propaganda to every citizen before the Republic will again take arms in an